Well, thank you very much, Carl, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the forum for inviting me to participate in this discussion on a topic that has been of great interest to me over a majority of my career, and certainly is of crucial interest to patient communities around the world. We're going to spend these first two sessions, as Carl said, diving into first an overview of R&D for prevalent chronic diseases and some of the unique barriers that have retarded investment relative to some other indications, namely rare diseases and cancer, for example. And then in the second session, we're going to get more into the details of what drives investment of key stakeholders in chronic disease research and development, including investors and drug sponsors. And then we'll discuss some of the common causes of failure and what can be done to mitigate those causes or to arrive at go, no-go decisions earlier in the development process, as well as what can be done around partnerships and community involvement to increase the success rates and to stimulate innovation for research and development in these prevalent chronic diseases. We're going to begin with a presentation from Russ Paulson, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Us Against Alzheimer's disease. I'll refer you all to the briefing book for more details on his bio. Russ, why don't you start us off?
Thanks, Susan. Thanks to Carl and Nantha, to the planning committee, to the forum, to the Academies. And thanks for you for attending. And thanks for putting the patient group first. When Carl was talking about COVID and comorbidities, it got me thinking about the disease that I'm going to talk about, Alzheimer's disease. It's impossible to have one person talking about one disease to represent all of the chronic diseases, but there are a lot of overlap. It is a rare Alzheimer's patient who doesn't have a comorbidity, and it's an awful common comorbidity of people with other chronic diseases to have Alzheimer's disease. Certainly true during COVID, the people who were dying were in nursing homes with Alzheimer's disease. And that still is sadly true today as we try to get those folks vaccinated. So this is, in a way, emblematic of other diseases. There are probably some things that are different. I'm not an expert in all the chronic diseases, but I'll talk about Alzheimer's. I'll try to draw parallels between Alzheimer's and other chronic diseases where I can. And again, there's so much overlap that I think that what you learned about Alzheimer's can be relevant for the other chronic diseases. The definition of today was about prevalent chronic diseases. And I want to talk about what that means in the Alzheimer's world. Every minute of every day in the United States, someone develops Alzheimer's disease. Every minute of every day in the US alone. And that rate is expected to roughly triple in the next 30 years if we don't do something about it. It is a massive share of the Medicare budget already, Medicaid budget already. It is overshadowing lots of things that states would like to do with Medicaid because Alzheimer's disease bankrupts people and then they're dependent on Medicaid to pay for their nursing home and care in their final days. Alzheimer's specifically is the only disease in the top 10 causes of death, according to the CDC, for which there is no effective treatment. It's 5.8 million people in the US, according to the best estimates today, again, expecting to triple roughly in the next 29 years. It is by that logic, a massive market. There are not very many other markets of this scale in the disease world. And yet, we see that there hasn't been a treatment for Alzheimer's approved in decades. There hasn't been a preventative approved for Alzheimer's ever. Now, part of that for Alzheimer's specifically, and I don't think this applies to all chronic diseases, part of that for Alzheimer's specifically is that while Dr. Alzheimer's discovered the plaques in the brain more than 100 years ago, we're in some ways a new disease. And I do think that that is something that is shared with other chronic diseases. So much of what we face in Alzheimer's still today is a sense of, well, that's just part of aging. These things happen as we get older. And so there's an acceptance of some of these chronic diseases as just the thing that happens as we get older. It's a burden for an awful lot of people, but many of those people who bear that burden just think that's part of life, part of aging. Now, we have some specific things in Alzheimer's related to the fact that we're a neurodegenerative disease. Many other diseases in the preclinical and discovery stage can be tested effectively in animal models. And that's not true in the neurological diseases, neurodegenerative neurological diseases. Mouse models don't work for us. We also don't have biomarkers. There is no HDL, LDL, cholesterol metric for Alzheimer's disease. There's no A1C. There's not blood pressure. There's nothing on that scale for Alzheimer's. What does that mean? Well, that means for Alzheimer's that clinical trials are slow to enroll. They take a very long time. And it's complicated even to qualify people for the disease. The way that you discover the underlying pathology of Alzheimer's disease is either with a PET scan, which is not even available, even if you want to, not even available all across the country. They're expensive. Or a lumbar puncture, which in the US, very few practitioners do. There is a blood test that is just on the market that is not as sensitive or specific as either of those two, that may make a difference over time. And there will be eventually some blood biomarkers. But right now, the best thing we have for Alzheimer's is a set of questionnaires to give people an indication of their clinical status. Scientists tell us that the pathology that underlies Alzheimer's disease is at work for 20 years before these clinical instruments detect the changes. So people are sick for 20 years before we ever know about it. The same way as, I guess, maybe atherosclerosis. But there's no blood biomarker to test for that. So people are getting sick and getting sicker. And because of all of that, because of the slowness of the clinical trials, because of the history, because of the underinvestment over time, I have a friend who is a neurologist who said that when he was coming up, he was told by his mentor, don't go into aging research, don't go into Alzheimer's research, that's where careers go to die. And it sets up a really rough cycle that I'll talk about in a second. The other thing about Alzheimer's is that in that 1 person per minute per day, it's not evenly distributed. If you are African American, it's twice as likely, the rate is twice the rate of white folks. Latinos, about 1.5x. Poor folks, we don't know the exact rate, but it's higher if you're poor. So it's a disease that is, like many chronic diseases, disproportionately affecting poor people, people of color, affecting an awful lot of folks. Unlike some, we don't have a biomarker. We have these clinical assessments. And the clinical assessments, by the way, are stuff that was developed before we really asked people. So one of the things that Us Against Alzheimer's did in the last couple of years is we looked at asking people, what matters to you about this disease? What are the symptoms that you would like to, as you step on this path, or as you are already on this path, what would you like to avoid or keep? And the classic stuff of, oh, I want to remember my kids' names. I want to be able to keep driving. Turns out those are not the top things that people who are on their dementia journey worry about. They worry about not being a burden to others. They worry about not being depressed. They worry about, there's a little bit about living independently, but a lot of them are neuropsychiatric symptoms. And yet, if you look at the scales that have been in use for this disease for the last 20 years, before we ever asked patients, neuropsychiatric symptoms are actually a relatively small number of things that are counted in. And in fact, in a lot of the, and we're talking about preclinical research today, but in the clinical research, a lot of the research has neuropsychiatric symptoms. If they're measured at all, they're an exploratory endpoint. They're not the primary endpoint. And yet what patients tell us is that they're really important. So we have a problem in Alzheimer's disease, and I think it's not uncommon to other chronic diseases. We don't fully understand the biology. Without the biomarkers, without a drug on the market, without accessible imaging, we don't have a full understanding of the biology of the disease. We have a history that is twofold. One is that people think it's sort of a normal part of aging. The other is that because it's sort of a new disease, because we don't understand the biology, there's not a lot of funding to do the research, which leads to a place where cancer, and it's tough to talk about competition among diseases, but the facts are cancer has about a 10 times the number of publications per year as Alzheimer's disease. And I think that's true of many chronic diseases. 10 times the publications results in more knowledge, which de-risks the development of new therapeutics and diagnostics for other diseases, for cancer. Alzheimer's, it's about less than 1 in 100 drugs that are tried for Alzheimer's succeed. The industry average is greater than 1 in 15. It's tough to talk about competition among diseases, but there is a finite pool of resources out there. As people think about where to put their money, whether it's in drug development, in research, or in building a new shopping mall, Alzheimer's is a lot like swinging for the fences. It's a big bet because there is a big possible market, but there is at this point no such thing as a steady 300 single base hitter in Alzheimer's. It's a guy taking big swings, and mostly they get caught in the outfield. So it's a vicious cycle then because of this lack of success, because this lack of understanding, there's this risk of investing in the disease, which is that we continue to know less and less. The smart money goes to where we know more and more, and that creates a virtuous cycle for those indications. But for the prevalent diseases where we don't know very much, we start out not knowing very much, we don't have the investment to learn more at the level that we need. And so we have a vicious cycle of a race sort of to the bottom. It's a classic example of market failure. The government stepped in the US for orphan drugs a while back. Maybe that's a solution here. Maybe there's something, as we have managed to increase the funding for the NIA budget to fund more research, to understand the biology better. But meanwhile, more people will die with Alzheimer's this year than will die from COVID. I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion on how we might move forward together to try to fix that. Thank you.
Russ, thank you for that presentation. There was at least one question that has come in from the webcast. Amanda, can you read us the question for Russ, please?
Yes, certainly. So a clarification question came in from the webcast audience. Are plaques considered biomarkers or are they post-disease?
Oh, I said we didn't fully understand the biology of the disease. So it's a question that I think if you got 5 Alzheimer's researchers in the room, you would get at least 5 different answers to that question. It is nonetheless the case that they are not easily quantified in the way that an A1C level or a cholesterol level or a blood pressure is. They're and where they fit in the disease trajectory is a matter of debate.